I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thanks for starting the recording. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a phenomenal response, and I think you're in for a treat this morning. I just have two quick notes before I hand over to Dr. van Lill. The first is, after the webinar, you can expect to receive an email. Firstly, with the BTI link, there's a feedback form and a short quiz that should be coming from hofmeyer@jbr.co.za. So please look out for that. There is a deadline to complete the BTI, which is by Thursday. So if you wouldn't mind doing that. And then the second note is the session isn't going to be as interactive as we may have hoped, partly because of the volume of information we have to get through and the amount of people on the call. But please feel free to post questions in the chat. Myself, Pakiza, and possibly Andrea will respond as best we can. We'll also take note of the more salient questions for a Q&A at the end of the masterclass. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Xander van Lill. Good luck.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you for putting aside 2 hours of your time to listen and join me in this journey through the periodic table, so-called periodic table of personality. Okay, here we go. All right, so just a little bit more information about myself. Andrew's introduced me, so just that I'm a registered industrial psychologist of the Health Professions Council of South Africa, and proudly so. I'm currently appointed as a senior researcher and practice as an industrial psychologist at JBR Africa Group. And I'm also cross-appointed as a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg, specifically in the Department of Industrial Psychology and People Management. 2 things that you need to know about me before we jump into the presentation. I'm high on openness to experience. We are going to talk about personality traits today. And as a consequence, I like to bring a lot of symbolism into my presentations and got a deep appreciation for the aesthetics. So my wife told me when I did a dry run with her, please just get them through the first 5 minutes and then everything will start to make sense. So there's some reference sometimes to music or to art, and the evidence is coming. So if you're less aesthetically inclined, please be patient with me. There is something to be learned after the journey. Then the second thing is I'm integrating findings of scholars and minds that are far greater than my own, particularly people like Colin de Young, people like Professor Visvesrand, Professor Sackett. Interestingly, many of these scholars situate at the Minnesota University. And so what I highly encourage you to do is to not use my presentation as the only reference as part of learning, but that we will send the slides more to the end of presentation and drop it in the chat. And there's a lot of references included there that I'd encourage you to read further on and to expand your knowledge and to be critical of what I say as well. So that brings me to the start or introduction, the 5 minutes that please you have to bear with me. And I'd like to use a wood edge that was engraved in the 1880s. And what you see depicted in front of you here is the famous mythical tale of Odyssey, where Odyssey had to cross a very different narrow passage by boat between what is referred to as Scylla and Charybdis. And Scylla was, in this famous passage, you had to make a difficult choice between two evils. You had to choose the lesser of two evils. On the one end, you had this 5, 6, 10-headed monster that picked off men from your boat, and on the other side, this whirlpool that sucked your boat in. And just like this mythological depiction, I think in a certain sense, we as practitioners and sometimes even scientists are between a rock and a hard place. This is where the expression also comes from when it comes to the measurement about our personality. And more specifically, at the one end, we've got this dimensionality issue around personality, where we have to make sense of what the factors are that personality consists of. And at the same time, these factors that we've previously identified has a very theoretical nature, and it's sometimes hard to make meaning of or use to describe why people do the things that they do. Yet on the other side, we've got this proliferation, I'm speaking about the whirlpool, of new personality assessments that are constantly developed, and with good reason, and it's fantastic as well, but each proposing their own structure of personality and own dimensions. So on the one hand, we have consensus, but we don't always have to interpret it on something like the 5-factor model. On the other side, we've got a proliferation of psychological assessments constantly newly being developed, but with little consensus about how the structure of personality should look like. And I'm going to try to argue today that just like Odysseus, we can rather move a bit closer to the headed monster and work with the current structure of personality as we currently know it, and relay some new evidence and maybe pick off a few of the people on the boat, than getting sucked down without having consensus about how personality should look like. But in route to this journey, I think we have to, there's fantastic tools available to us that can help us to make sense of the dimensionality of personality. And here I'm going to rely on a quote by a famous inventor and AI expert called Dennis Hassabis. He was involved in what is known as AlphaGo, or the first machine learning based algorithm that beat the world best player at a complicated game called Go. And they were also involved in the development of AlphaFold, which is a form of deep learning to make sense of how protein folding works in the human body. Now, they obviously didn't do this in isolation, and they did it interdisciplinary with neuroscience and machine learning and engineering, or several other fields working together. And just as with the development of AlphaFold, I think in order to navigate this difficult territory and to make sense of personality, we also have to rely on an interdisciplinary collaboration, more specifically between fields such as neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and obviously personality psychology as well. And I think, just like Dennis Hassabis says, is that the future of personality, in the future of personality, the big breakthroughs will be interdisciplinary ones, where we make connections between disparate subjects, and that'll probably happen as we continue along this exciting and interesting journey in personality, both from a theoretical point of view and an assessment point of view. Now, what's interesting is if we adopt these different disciplines, neuroscience and evolutionary psychology specifically, we're almost become sort of biologists. And in this case, as psychologists, we only study one particular species, and that is humans. But when we do that, we might get to what's often referred to as first principles, a word that is derived from physics and typically refers to what those theoretical postulates, or these basic propositions or basic building stones are of our field. And almost like in chemistry, where we've got the periodic table with these basic elements, we need to start build what is referred to periodic table of personality. And as Woods and Anderson says, within personality measurement in applied settings, the lack of an equivalent periodic table of personality has hampered our understanding of the underlying structures, measurement, comprehensiveness, and synergistic developments. And I believe that through this interdisciplinary focus between neuroscience, personality, and evolutionary psychology, we might be able to identify what these basic elements are that we're working from a personality perspective. And also, not only that, you know that the periodic table is also about the relative relationships of our dimensions to each other. We'll also better understand how specific personality dimensions speak to each other. So, and this is where a piece of music is coming. Obviously, our new insights will be a creative, integrative understanding. And it's almost a layered perspective where we add additional perspectives from other fields. And it sometimes could be threatening, but it's important that we ever increase our understanding of the field by also considering these other fields. And this doesn't happen in isolation, and we have to consider also empirically testing and underscoring or trying to prove these new insights that we gain through rigorous scientific research. And so you'll have a cyclical process between the art and science in personality psychology. Now, just to show you how beautifully layered things could be, I'd like to play a beautiful piece of music. And it's not detracting or taking away from this piece of music, but really adding to it. So there was the famous composer Vivaldi, who written the Four Seasons. more specifically spring in this case that I'll be playing. And that has been recomposed or reinterpreted and added, I'd like to argue, more beauty to it by Max Richter, a German composer. And then on that recomposition by Max Richter, there's also been a beautiful ballet group that has reinterpreted called The Birds that I'm going to play to you now. And just to show that additional layers of interpretation shouldn't be threatening, but it could add value. Now, if you find the ballet impression or quite jarring, you're welcome to close your eyes and listen to the music. Lay back, imagine yourself like Vivaldi being in Venice and walking through narrow corridors and appreciating the gondoliers driving with the gondolas along the canals in Venice. And hopefully that could be relaxing as well. Thank you so much. That brings me to the agenda for today. And I will focus on, firstly, the origins of not only the measurement of personality, but its theoretical origins. Then we'll speak about the evolutionary history behind traits as adaptations. I'll propose the so-called periodic table of personality based on existing research and literature on the personality domain, or the so-called structural hierarchy of traits, what its possible and current evidence suggests its neurobiological foundations are, and then I'll apply or make a few recommendations about its applications in the workplace. Now, this has a slight work-related psychology sort of slant, but there is a nice piece about its applications to counseling or developments in counseling and more on a clinical side as well, for those of you who are not registered as industrial psychologists. But the rest of the presentation should still be relevant. And then I'll give a few takeaways based on what I've discussed. But before I do that, we are going to do a little adjective exercise. And an adjective is simply a word that describes a noun. And with the noun in this case, I'd like you to think about a person that you greatly admire, a person that you revere. And I would like you, if it's possible, in the chat to give me a few words that you would like to use to describe that in the people that you appreciate in your life. It could be any descriptive words from any descriptive words should be fine. Okay, so insightful, thoughtful, talented, caring, artistic, forgiving, honest, justice warrior, open, empathetic, authentic, fair, courageous, dedicated, inspirational, kind, humorous. Okay. So what's fantastic is that just like the words, the adjectives that you guys just shared is so interestingly, the development of personality was the development of personality. So we've got these interestingly words like generous, for example, has been used, which has is related to something like a personality trait agreeableness, or dedicated might be a word to describe somebody who's very conscientious, or elegant, or I've seen artistic as descriptions for typical trait like openness to experience. And so a lot of the descriptive words that you've already used can be in some other way subsumed into personality theories. Oops, let me just get this thing going again. Okay, so I'll make why I did that adjective exercise salient soon, but I just want to lay the theoretical groundwork for the rest of the presentation so that everybody knows what we are going to talk about when we refer to personality. So we can define personality as traits or dimensions that describe the consistent patterns in how people think, feel, and act. And I think that's sufficient enough to describe or lay the groundwork when we're referring to personality for today. And I'm not going to refer, I'm going to specifically refer here to trait-based theories of personality in this particular presentation. Now, with the adjective exercise, you've used everyday words in natural language to describe people that you revere. And just like that, so was the origins of personality. So initially, personality scholars looked for and socially relevant. Obviously, these words are quite useful because when we can ascribe or attribute certain characteristics to people, we can make inference about what they will do in the future as well, and create more stability in our mutual understanding of each other as a consequence of our use of such language. And so just like the everyday words that we use, these things are often also captured in dictionaries. And what original personality researchers like Alport and Odbert did is they've identified descriptive terms that are captured in dictionaries that describe other people interpersonally. And they've originally identified 18,000 terms. Now, if I had to make sense or cluster or run an analysis on that, it would be a daunting task. So I think the same scholars initially reduced it to 5,000 terms, and then Cattell further reduced those naturally used descriptive terms and sorted them around 35 variables, and almost less than 1% of the original terms that was identified. He then applied what's referred to as a factor analytic technique or a clustering technique to see how these 35 variables naturally cluster together. And that's also what resulted in what we today know as these 16 factors captured in the 16 personality factor questionnaire. Now, Fiske took the research further, and they've identified the 5 factors, and it was Norman who in the 1960s relabeled those traits more akin to what we know today as the 5-factor model. And then the famous Louis Goldberg, along with his colleague, did another factor analysis, this time on a separate 355 adjectives that they've originally identified, and they were able to also replicate the 5-factor model that was originally identified. And there we had the start, and quickly thereafter, proliferation of research on what we now know today as the 5-factor model of personality. Now, I think this development in personality also holds an important lesson from a theory building perspective. Now, we often are very hastily to reject simple correlational studies based on real observations in the real world as Dust Bowl empiricism, as if we're just making arbitrary relationships, seeing arbitrary relationships between correlations. Now, that is possible, but at the same time, we also sometimes run the risk, if we're too busy with armchair philosophy and removed from the real world, of building theories that don't often always fit the real world. And we almost fetishize theories and stick with them, even though they aren't always perfect explanations of how things happen in the real world external to ourselves and our theorizing about it. And so sometimes theory might create a preconceived idea of the natural phenomena, in this case, characteristics that describe people that we'd like to use. And so what's so fantastic about lexical-based research, per the scholars that I've referred to earlier in the previous slide, is that they followed a strictly lexical approach, or a very empirical approach, to the investigation of human nature. And as a consequence of this sort of almost atheoretical approach, they almost captured something about the real world existence, almost these biological substructures that have emerged in people across a long time, that are used to describe and make us successful to adapt to our environment. But with that said, even something like the 5-factor model or the 2-factor, we'll get to that a bit later, there are no sacred cows in personality psychology. So even something like the 5-factor model needs to be subjected to empirical scrutiny and replications across the world before we can make any claims about its universal truth. And so any personality taxonomy should still be subject to scientific scrutiny, and that, of course, like I mentioned, should include its replicability across different countries. And so not only looking at the structure of personality itself, but also we have to continue, and there's a good bevy of, but we can continue this to also expand personality theory by connecting it to other frames, to see how personality relates to our motivation or even our performance in the workplace, to build out what's often referred to as its nomenological network. And so what I wanted to highlight in short with this slide is that there's something beautiful about how trait personality emerge due to its atheoretical nature, but it's both its own vice and virtue, and I'll get to how we can overcome its vice a little bit later. Before I jump into the evolutionary history, or at least evolutionary theories of personality, I've purposely included a blank slide. So don't be alarmed when you see nothing in front of you, nothing has gone haywire. What I almost want to do with slide is, and you'll see at the bottom, there's a question: what's the nature of human nature? And often there's this nature-nurture argument. And I'm definitely not, what you see in front of you with the white slide almost represents a blank slate. And some would like to make the claim that people are blank slates. They come into the world not pre-programmed or with any natural proclivities, and that we can mold people and make them whatever we want them to be. The famous Skinner quote, if, say, for example, operant condition, we can create any type of person in the world. Now, I certainly don't think that is the case. I don't think we come in as blank slates, and I do believe that there's, and I'll relay some evidence related to that, some predispositions in people to act in a certain way. That doesn't throw away completely the nurture argument. It's still important, and that's a point that I'll make a bit later. But there generally seems to be some evidence to suggest that there's strong genetic influences on how we act and behave in the real world. Which brings me to evolutionary psychology. So according to De Young, and this is a brilliant article that I'd highly recommend. I think it's an open source article that you can get access to. I think published in an international journal called Personality Psychology. And he argues that we should almost think of evolutionary of personality as a cybernetic design. Now, what a cybernetic design is, just interestingly, we spoke about the interdisciplinary nature of where psychology and the study of personality is heading, is something that was adopted from information technology. And a cybernetic design just refers to something that is a self-regulating system, and also very applicable to humans as well, because we essentially set goals for ourselves. We act upon those goals that we've set, or devise strategies and then act upon those strategies to achieve our goals. But we don't just aspire or pursue our goals. We also, based on the information that we collect as we try to enact our goals, sort of revise the initial goals that we've set. And so as a consequence, we can not only strive to something, but adjust our strategies in order to more effectively pursue maybe alternative or the same things in a better way in the future. And as a consequence, we have the self-regulating ability in us, even built into our personality, that helps us to adjust to the world. Now, in the argument, he beautifully argues that this is a species typical evolution that has occurred in us because the environment, through throwing us with chaos and suddenly we have to adjust, but also having the necessity to stably pursue outcomes together, have evolved in us over time through selection pressures that have been placed on us, specifically through something like selective mating. And so you can almost think of traits as this universal architecture that have developed in us to adjust to situations and achieve our goals, mainly to survive and reproduce, and reproduce to propagate the species into the future. And in order to prove the universality, like I mentioned, you have to show that it's got it can be replicated across other countries. And there certainly has been some studies that have been able to replicate the 5-factor model and other 10 aspects in the South African context. I think on the BTI, there was a study done by Grobler and de Beer on, I think, 100,000 respondents to look at across language groups if the 5-factor replicates in the South African context. And me and Dr. Nicola Taylor has also been able to replicate the 10 aspects, something that I'll speak about a little bit later in the South African context. Now, interestingly, so one could ask, how big a role does nature play? And it appears as if almost 60 to 80% of variation in trait scores could be explained by hereditary. And that's based on twin studies that Riemann and Kunder has conducted. But with that said, I mentioned that people are not blank slates, but people are some of the blankest of slates of the animal kingdom. So we're not entirely blank slates, but our traits is not an excuse. And it would be wrong to say that what we do is solely based on genetics. That is a a dangerous rabbit hole to go down. And what most personality psychologists seem to agree on is that we should more think of traits as phenotypes, not genotypes. So phenotypes means how these genotypes play out in the real world. And we know that these personality, even though there's a hereditary component to it, is strongly influenced and genetically activated by events that occur in the real world. So it's not an either or, but a both type of argument that I think most psychologists know well in personality research. Both are hereditary, but also our environment plays a role in shaping how we think, feel, and act in the real world. So let's take this replication argument a bit further and put this test of the 5-factor model's replication across the world to the test. And I've recently discovered this fascinating study that has been published by Durkee, but also by Professor David Buss, I think at Texas University, famous personality scholar, also famous for his work on evolutionary psychology. And what they did is they investigate and accumulated a sample across 115 nations. And they wanted to determine if there is an interesting environmental factor that influences the structure of personality across nations. And they've sampled almost 700,000 people across the world to determine what the impact of niche diversity is on how differentiated personality models are across the world. Now, what they meant with niche diversity, it's almost like I'd like to put like, what's the differentiation or the variety of jobs that you get in a particular country? So it includes something like your sectoral diversity, the volume-weighted variety of your nation's exports, or urbanization. We know that there's more opportunities available in cities. And obviously your HDI, your average level of education, gross domestic product, and life expectancy in a country. And so what you see is the more niche an environment is, the more likely to get lower intertrait covariance and greater personality dimensions across nations, just to mean that the more differentiated and specific your personality models become as a consequence of the niche environment that you live in. And just so happen is that how niche your environment is and how differentiated you are in your personality dimensions is also determinant for how successful you're going to be in that environment. And it's interesting to see that something like niche environment influences how complicated and how nuanced and how varied the structure of personality is in different countries. But with that said, there are still specifically the 2-factor model of personality that I'll get to later when I speak about the periodic table or the structure of personality that seem to replicate across countries. And then as it becomes more complex with the 5-factor or the 10 aspects, depending on how niche the environment is, you don't always see evidence for those depending on the niche environment. So that's a possible explanation and something that we have to keep in the back of our minds when we think about the replicability of personality. So let's speak about the South African context. Fortunately, they've also included our country in the study. And it's interesting to see that South African has a moderate niche diversity. So it's expected that it's not unexpected that something like the 5-factor model or even something like the 10 aspects, more nuanced personality models replicate to our context. And here I have to give credit to incredible work that has been done from a lexical perspective in our context. So Vollmeyer and Schweng has argued that we have to take an emic and etic approach to the development of personality. And so while we consider international models of personality, we also have to do our own lexical research, go back to how words are used in our diverse languages in South Africa and see how what personality structures emerged from the natural language that South Africans typically use. And incredibly so, and this is a study that has been complemented by, I think, Vollmeyer as well as an example of how things should be done internationally, spearheaded by people like Professor Oliver Nel and the late Professor Dion Meyering and Professor Dion de Bruin and Professor Shumaya Law, a lot of colleagues, and also the late Professor Fons van der Vyver. And they've done lexical research in the South African context. And interestingly, they've initially discovered that there was 9 distinct attributes or concepts that could be of personality that could be defined and identified based on their studies of dictionaries in the South African, also interviews with people in the South African context of the South African Personality Inventory Project. However, they further reduced this dimensionality later to eventually include 6 of the 9 dimensions, and it looked very much interesting here. Also came back to a big 5-factor model of personality, with the exception of 2 dimensions that they've differentiated in agreeableness, namely positive and negative social relation factors. So this 5-factor model is something that seems to be replicated and emerge even from natural language in the South African context. And there's also preliminary evidence for both the configural and metric invariance across Africa, Black African, colored Indian, and white participants in the South African context. So studies of South Africa, we've got exceptional personality psychologists in the South African context, and these are people's work worth reading, and some of them might be, I think, open source, the study by Morton specifically. So I'd highly recommend that you take note of these studies and read them further. Okay, so we've spoken about the evolutionary history, some evidence for its universal claim, how it looks in South Africa. Now let's speak about our periodic table of personality. And I'm going to do this at the hand of what we've seen, especially emerge in something like the basic traits inventory and some of the work that I've done with Dr. Nicola Taylor. So what we do know is right up of the most simplest, right at the top way to represent personality are the 2 what's often referred to as meta traits, because the 5-factor model or the 5 traits aren't uncorrelated with each other. They do seem to have something in relation. And so some of the, I'll get to that a little bit later, some of the traits seem to cluster together to make these 2 traits at the higher level. There's also an argument that you get a 1-factor of personality. I'm slightly skeptical. I think the variation between the 5 traits could be better explained by the 2 traits at this stage, and it'd be safe to rather use these meta traits as the highest level of personality in our periodic table. Of course, the 2 traits further break down into the famous 5 personality traits, named conscientiousness, neuroticism, agreeableness, extroversion, openness to experience. And then there is building evidentiary support to suggest that there are 10 personality aspects and even biological reasons for their existence, because we, depending on the personality measure, there appears to be less consensus on how many personality facets we should have. And these could be very, I mean, in the BTI, it's 22, and other personality measures, it could be more or less. So there appears to be less consensus about the number of and even the biological substructures for something like personality facets. But we seem to have more consensus on these 10 aspects as the lower substructure of the 5-factor model. And so each of those 5 traits appear to be able to break down into 10 more personality aspects. And when you do that, interesting relationships also emerge between different personality dimensions, which I'll unpack a little bit later. And then finally, you've got personality descriptions that are often used in personality measures. And at the lower level, obviously, this also depends on the personality measure used. And so it could vary across from measurement to measurement. So at least from a measurement perspective and theoretically, there seems to be more consensus on the 2 personality meta traits, the 5 personality traits, and the 10 personality aspects. And this is the level of personality that I'll also focus on in our periodic table of personality. So let's start with the meta traits. So cybernetic systems, and I'm going to verbatimly quote Colin de Young here, not only must be capable of maintaining stable functioning, but they must also be sufficiently plastic to adapt to changing and unpredictable environments. And so we try to depict with this yin-yang symbol is that, and these are cyclical processes, they are not opposites of each other, but they mutually reinforce each other. And so while as humans, we have to be able to deal with, or firstly be able to stably work together in social groups and collaborate in order to achieve our collective goals, we also have to be able to deal with change that's, and nature throws us a curveball every now and then, and we have to deal with the chaos that an entropy that it presents, or the general law of entropy anyway, in order to deal with our natural environments. And so in the cyclical process, it's interesting to also see that we've adapted to meta traits as a whole to deal with these common challenges that the environment has posed to us over time. And so we have stability, meta trait, what's often also referred to as meta trait stability, also sometimes referred to as integrity, to help us maintain stable functioning. And I'll break down its constituent traits in order to show how those traits contribute stability a little bit later. But at the same time, we also have to have meta trait plasticity, sometimes referred to as plasticity. Also, I'm going to refer to it here as flexibility, to deal with the chaos that the natural environment throws us. Now, like I mentioned, stability and plasticity are not, these two meta traits are not, they're not opposites of each other, but they work in a supposed to work in a complementary way in order to help us successfully adjust to our environments. And so they have a zero order correlation with each other. That's also why we can say that there's not one general factor, but two traits, because they seem to stand more loose from each other. And so the opposite of stability is not flexibility. The opposite of stability is being impulsive and not being able to self-regulate your impulses to help a collective to achieve common goals. And the opposite of flexibility is not stability. It's rigidity, or the unwillingness to take in new information or explore things external to itself. And if I can use an example of this from a neuro psychotherapy point of view, the famous Dr. Klaus Grave once used the concept of controllable incongruence in therapy, but I think so beautifully explains this interchange between these two meta traits. And so in therapy, when you're giving a client therapy, you want to create a holding and safe environment, and you want to challenge the client just enough to be just slightly flexible enough so that it doesn't overwhelm their system, but that they still take in new information. And so even in that situation, in that very tumultuous context, having acknowledging, creating a holding environment while slightly challenging without, creating sense of control, but little incongruence to bring about new change in that client's process might be quite useful. And also visualize this very dynamic interplay between something like stability and flexibility. Okay, so let's talk about meta trait stability and its constituent traits. So when I speak about meta trait stability, I'm going to refer to it as our self-regulating mechanism in order to control our impulses in order to achieve longer-term goals. And there's a strong evidence to suggest that there's a serotonergic hormonal substructure related to this meta trait in the brain. And this meta trait sort of explained the covariance between three of the five personality traits. So it appears as if something like conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism tend to co-vary. They don't stand loosely from each other and seem to make up this larger trait called stability or integrity. I use the word integrity because what you'll often see is in meta-analytical studies or in the industrial psychology field that there's integrity is one of your strongest predictors of something like job performance, but it also just so happened that integrity is a composite trait that is inferred from these three dimensions. Okay, so each of these five traits contributes to overall stability in unique ways. And so when we speak about conscientiousness in this context, it refers to the protection of non-immediate goals. So it's our motivational stability, not just jumping into fun activities, but keeping that larger goal to study, maybe to pursue a degree in personality, that long-term goal in mind, and in a self-disciplined and effortful way, striving towards that goal on the long end without giving too much expression to or enactment to the immediate goals that we have to achieve. Then we also have agreeableness, and we as humans don't function independently of each other. Independently, like I heard Dr. Ryan Sherman often use this quote, independent, we're almost smushy and easy to be picked off by predators. So a lot of our accomplishments accomplishments can also be attributed to the fact that as a collective, we're able to work together to achieve our collective goals. And so social stability is also important. And this is often facilitated through agreeableness by helping us to be more empathetic to others or polite and accommodating. And then finally, obviously, neuroticism or emotional stability. Now, neuroticism has a negative connotation. I'll use the inverse of that. In our natural past, these almost natural defensive type of reactions have served as well, but in the current context, something like emotional stability is more suitable. And so dealing with the emotional pressures that pose to us also helps us, provides us with that emotional stability and able to self-regulate in order to achieve our goals. That brings me to meta-trait stability or meta-trait plasticity. That can also be referred to as flexibility. And here it refers more to whereas the previous one is about the stability and the cooperation to achieve our collective goals and maintain that social functioning. Here it's about dealing with the chaos, and it's about exploring new things in order to adjust our strategies or even set new goals. So it's about behaviorally exploring things external to ourselves, but also taking in new information to adjust our strategies or maybe even set entirely new goals in order to deal with the chaos that's presented to us. And here, something like, or it appears to be strong evidence to suggest that our dopaminergic has a strong influence on our drive and our motivation to seek things external to ourselves, and is that biological substructure also plays a role in meta-trait or is associated with meta-trait plasticity. And so meta-trait plasticity, once again, something like extroversion and openness to experience appears to be correlated with each other, and they have something in common, namely this degree of being flexible and open to new information. And the one serves the function of helping us to, so we often, interestingly, we often think of extroversion as a sociability or gregariousness trait, but it's not entirely quite the case. Extroversion is more about reward-seeking behavior, and it's just coincidental that humans find rewards in social interactions with other people. And so extroversion is more about reward-seeking behavior, and the sociability associated with it is coincidental because we find social interactions very rewarding. And so extroversion actually refers to our motivation or behavioral exploration of engaging with or even seeking rewards external to ourselves. Whereas openness to experience is more about cognitive exploration, and it's about seeking or detecting, appreciating, understanding, and using new information in order to adjust our strategies or even set new goals. And so, like I said, these two meta traits doesn't occur in isolation, or I mean, they're not opposites of each other, but they form part of a dynamic interplay between each other. And so beautifully, you could be high on both of them at the same time, or you could be low on one and low on the other, or you can be low on both. Theoretically, that could potentially happen. And so you do get people who are high on both stability, meta-trait stability and flexibility, or if they've got a good personality integration. If you're more interested, there's been some incredible work from a circumplex point of view being done by Struss and Zizek in the past. And so both you can have this propensity to strive and work with others to achieve goals, but at the same time be open for new information and adjust yourself to what is required by the environment at the same time. Some people could be high on stability, but low, but also low in flexibility or have higher rigidity. So they might display a degree of self-restraint or be overly perfectionistic or overly conforming and struggle to take in new information or explore things external to themselves or adjust their goals, even though they're successfully striving to their goals, struggle to adjust their goals in order to meet the chaos that the environment presents. You can also be very sensation-seeking. So overly, excessively striving or being seek out new information, explore new behavior, explore new things while kind of enacting every impulse that you have and not self-regulating yourself to achieve future goals. And then finally, you could be low on both flexibility and stability, or you could be highly rigid and impulsivity and experience what's referred to as personality disharmony. Now, I'm not saying please don't diagnose psychopathology from normal personality. I'm not arguing for that, but it does appear as if psychological maladjustment might happen in some cases when all dimensions on personality is lower, and something to take note of. It also seems to be a disharmony in personality from a circumplex point of view based on this. The scholars below here seems to be also related to lower well-being. And that brings me to the second. So we've spoken about the two meta traits in personality. We've spoken about the 5 traits of personality, and I'd like to go into a little bit more depth, namely the 10 aspects of personality that I've mentioned earlier. And so here we'll be focusing on interesting the differentiation between the 2 aspects below each trait that seems to have something unique, independent of each other under this broader umbrella of each of the 5 factors that we've previously identified in personality. And there's an accumulating knowledge on this. This is the lowest level. I'd like to also refer to it. It's almost like there's different structures to things, but this is the closest I think that we currently have to our periodic table, and quite a useful typology that's not too detailed or not too broad, but I think quite interpretable, especially if you know how to explain what their function is and describe why people have adopted these characteristics over time. Okay, so firstly, conscientiousness can be divided between industriousness and orderliness, where industriousness would refer to the degree to which we are able to prioritize those non-immediate goals and not enact our immediate impulses, but strive for that longer-term things. And orderliness, more akin to differentiated from industriousness and more akin to following self-set rules or rules set by others. So there's a dependability type of thing related to conscientiousness. There's and when I refer to self-set rules, it's also to put boundaries for ourselves in place en route to achieving our long-term goals. So it's putting routines and habits, structuring our immediate environment in order to help us stay focused on these long-term goals that we have to achieve. So it's not only being abiding and holding to your commitments that you make to other people, but also creating self-set rules that help you to regulate yourself en route to your longer-term goals. So industriousness would be how effortful you are, and orderliness would be more akin to something like how likely you are to organize your environment around you. Then agreeableness can be divided also between 2 aspects, referred to as politeness and compassion. Politeness speaks more to preventing yourself from engaging in norm-violating behavior. It's being well-mannered in the company of other people, while compassion is more about the emotional attachment that you form with other people, whether you can empathetically listen and take other people's views into consideration and be pro-social towards them. And so this is quite an important differentiation, because someone might be polite, but they can use it to masquerade their compassion. They lower compassion, but at the same time, let's say, for example, if you find that the academic environment was quite fitting for your personality, it might serve you well there. You might not be polite and argumentative, but you really do care. And so sometimes these things could also be differentiated. Then with neuroticism, or the inverse of that would be emotional stability, you have what's referred to as volatility and withdrawal. So here I'm also going to draw a distinction between internalizing and externalizing stress, avoiding and approaching type of approaches to dealing with stress. And so with volatility, it refers to almost that aggressive or frustrated response to immediate threat. It's almost our flight or fight type of reaction to our external environment, whereas withdrawal associated with depression or anxiety is more related to the avoidance or internalizing your stress and avoiding a particular outcome in your life. Extroversion, like I previously mentioned, and I'll re-emphasize as we continue, extroversion is less about our social proclivities and actually is more about reward-seeking behavior. And if you understand that, suddenly something like the 2 aspects also makes quite meaningful sense, because extroversion you'll often see that there's an ascendance or a social dominance thing to extroversion as well, moving up. I like to take the leadership position, to be in the center of attention. And so this assertiveness thing is also argued to have a motivational component to it, to drive us to seek things external to ourselves. But at the same time, we've almost got this reinforcing loop in extroversion. So in a certain sense, our dopaminergic systems, and especially if we're higher in extroversion, drives us to behaviorally explore things external to ourselves or drive us towards our goals. But at the same time, we also need something that tells, okay, you've pursued this. Now that you've achieved this, oh, this is quite nice. Maybe you should do that again in the future. And you've got this reinforcing loop. Go seek things external to yourself. And oh, if it's nice, do that again in the future. And that's what enthusiasm is about. It's about the enjoyment of that goal attainment. And so, you'll see that something like in the personality substructure of extroversion, you also often have facets like positive affectivity. That is subsumed under larger trait extroversion. And then finally, we've got openness to experience. And here there's an interesting link about how we make sense of and integrate information. So with openness to experience can be divided between both intellect and openness. Now, interestingly, openness, the openness side of openness to experience is more about making connections between things. So it's exploring and appreciating beauty in the world and seeking it in the world and being imaginative. It helps us to make interesting connections between things. Yet, at the same time, we know sometimes we have to be careful about just making connections between anything. And so, let's say, for example, sometimes you can make arbitrary connections between things, maybe Bill Gates, vaccines, okay, maybe we put microchips in our arms. And so we have to be careful sometimes. And so we also have this additional things that helps us out, such as intellect, which is more about the logic of the relationships between things. And what you actually have here is not only searching and making connections between things, but also evaluating those connections that you make between things that are an important cycle. And what we see is often, and once again, I'm not saying that you can diagnose a normal personality, but there is some hint that being very high on openness but lower on intellect in the same personality profile could lead to people sometimes experiencing hallucinations or even have false beliefs about the nature of reality. And so a very interesting dynamic also between these two aspects under openness to experience when we think about its real world applications that I'll also touch on a bit later. Now, just to show you, I see that the periodic table is not only about understanding the substructure, but it's also understand what interesting new relationships pop out given our current periodic table that we have, because these elements we also should also help us to clarify what the relative relationships are between these elements. Now, the first, and I'm not going to give you a lot of observations based on this, but the first thing that I want to bring to your attention is look at how different, when you split industriousness and orderliness from each other, how different their correlations are from something like the neuroticism aspects. You can see that industriousness has a much higher negative correlation than something like orderliness have with those dimensions. In some cases, they've even found that when you control for industriousness, orderliness sometimes have a positive relationship with neuroticism, which was quite unexpected. And if you think about it, it's not that far-fetching. We know that if sometimes with an oversense of perfectionism or self-set rules or a cautiousness about how we approach the world could lead us to almost be overly perfectionistic or compulsive and obsessive about things. And so it also is often associated with a high latency of negative emotionality that could accompany it. And here you already see some meaningful and interesting findings when you start to differentiate those the 5-factor model into its constituent personality aspects. Another thing that I'd like to present to you is, even though theorized to be orthogonal, you see that something like enthusiasm here is correlated with compassion. And that might be due to the fact that they're both interpersonally related. We know that often extroversion and something like agreeableness could be placed on a personality circumplex. and that you can infer very interesting leadership dimensions from that. But both enthusiasm and compassion have an interpersonal sort of substructure underlying in it. It's not surprising, but it's meaningful to see that play out when you divide things into its constituent personality aspects. Another fascinating thing is that you almost get between industriousness, assertiveness, and intellect, the components of conscientiousness, the components of extroversion, a aspect of openness. These things also seem to have correlations with each other beyond what other personality aspects have with each other. And so what they're postulating is that there might be a sort of heroic trait associated with industriousness, intellect, and assertiveness, almost characteristics that make people exceptional, almost heroic, and that we want to emulate as followers. And I'm going to relay evidence to a little bit later based on a study that we've done with the Work Personality Index that suggests that this cluster of aspects is also related to something like leadership performance. And this is all just to show you that when you break the 5 factors into its 10 aspects and the so-called periodic table, there's very interesting relationships that come to the fore that we wouldn't necessarily have known if we didn't explore it in the past, or looked at a too detailed or a too broad way at personality. Just to relay some of the evidence that we've done or have on the 10 aspects. So we had a look at whether this 10 personality aspects replicate in the South African context. And myself and Dr. Nicola conducted a study. I'm not going to go into too much detail with the characteristics of the sample that we used. It's available on the screen, and it will be on the slides that you see. And this was also a locally developed test developed by Professor De Bruin and Dr. Nicola Taylor. And we conducted a hierarchical factor analysis to see if we could have replicated these findings. Oops. And so here's a framework of how we clustered the facets under these 10 personality aspects. I'm going to just use 1 or 2 examples. So, for example, enthusiasm subsumes gregariousness and positive affectivity, and industriousness subsumed something like facets or effort and self-discipline, and orderliness, order, dutifulness, and prudence. You'll see that once you receive your own personality profile, how these things cluster together. And we continue to test if these 10 aspects would be a fair representation of these aspects. And how we did that is, and say, for example, for agreeableness, we specified in a bifactor model that there was a personality aspect, compassionate personality aspect, politeness, that explained variance in the items, and at the same time specified that there's also these normal facets. And we wanted to see, do these 2 aspects explain so much variance in the item data that they could stand independently and represent more parsimonious, or provide more parsimonious representations of these items. And here we're not saying that you can't use facets anymore. Absolutely not. It's a this and. So we adding to personality structure. We're not taking away or saying that you can't use facet level data. Facet level data is still enormously important and provides context about the aspects and larger traits as well. But it's just to say that can we safely use something like the 10 aspects based on a personality measure in the South African context? And I'm not going to go into too much detail here. What I do want to draw your attention to is just the amount of common variance, ECV, that is explained by these facets. You'll see there's only 7 because in some cases, and this has also been done in prior meta-analysis with the NAO, you often find that there's only one aspect that speaks to a particular aspect. And so we only had 7 composite traits that we could investigate in this study. It's been published in AJOPA, so you're welcome to go read further on it if you're interested. But you can see that there was a significant amount of common variance explained by almost 60% in the lowest case by enthusiasm. And so there's a large amount of variance that each of these aspects represent in the item level data, and independent of the facets could be meaningful substructures that we can validly use. I'm not saying for all personality measures, and I recommend that anybody explore those things further. And it's amazing to see if this could be replicated in other measures. but it does seem to replicate for some personality measures in the South African context and could be safely used. All right, so now that I've spoken about the structure and the substructure and the periodic table of personality, I'd like to address more about the so-called neurological substructure of personality by unpacking it based on the trait and 10 personality abstract level. I've already mentioned that on a meta-trait level, we know that there's a serotonergic sort of substructure that's related to meta-trait stability, and you'll see it coming out throughout in conscientiousness and in neuroticism and in agreeableness. And at the same time, there's a dopaminergic substructure related to plasticity, or that's going to come out in when we discuss openness to experience and extroversion as well. But before we get to that, and I think it was so aptly put by Dr. Colin de Jong and his colleague Blaine. So he said that traditionally and in the past, we continue and continuously, personality psychology has aimed to explain why do people think, feel, and behave the way they do. That's an important, and more also because individual differences has implications in clinical, industrial, educational, and several forensics, very different applied fields in psychology. We also have to understand how these characteristics differ across people in order to make predictions about their behavior in the future. However, like I mentioned previously, the vice of the five-factor model was that it had a very atheoretical nature, and sometimes, even though it explains individual differences, it's difficult to interpret and make sense why people differ on these characteristics. And so, hopefully, I've already colored in the picture with the periodic table, but I'd like to make it even more salient as we go through the neurobiological findings of what current evidence exists on the relations between brain structures, hormonal structures in the brain, and even networks in the brain with these personality characteristics. And so research over the past century has been more descriptive. How do people differ, but less explanatory in some sense? And Colin de Jong is of the opinion, and I'm inclined to agree, that personality neuroscience can help us to explain how people differ in two important ways. Firstly, if we can trace or see that personality is associated with particular brain structures, we also know that these things have evolved and cemented in our historical history. And as a consequence, we can theorize about what their proximal causes are based on evolutionary psychology for its existence in the brain. Now, we can, so prior research has been done by Hans Eysenck, and not without his criticism. A lot of criticism has been lodged, but he had very limited tools at his availability. And with the proliferation of new technology, like something like functional magnetic resonance imaging, we start to see an emerging and burgeoning field of substantial evidence on the associations between personality and the brain. Another point that I'd also just like to make and bring to your attention is, so this is an emerging field. And so I'm not going to say that these neuroscientific evidence or associations between all dimensions of personality, and it is still an emerging field, but an exciting field. And there's a lot more findings that's still coming out. I think even recently, something that I didn't capture in this presentation, Colin de Jong has relayed new evidence on relationship of new findings on neurological dimensions with agreeableness, which we'll unpack shortly. So what you'll see is when there isn't any evidence, I don't state it, and I'm not going to make it up either. So, and these are interesting fields that we as psychologists, perhaps even with medical experts in the future, could collaborate on to see if we can't find more interesting findings or refute evidence in support of associations being made. So I mentioned that there's the serotonin substructure in the brain will come out, or the hormonal structure will come out throughout the three personality dimensions under meta-trait stability, and here you can see it being the case as well. But it's interesting that in the in conscientiousness, or specifically under brain structures, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seem to be associated with an inhibition of immediate things and pursuing more immediate goals, and then associated the lateral orbifrontal cortex also with the valuation or understanding what the relative priorities of things are. And as a consequence, in this broader brain network, or the ventral attention network, or the salience network, you almost have this proclivity, and especially people who are higher on conscientiousness, to not only prioritize and determine what the importance of things are, but also preventing ourselves from getting distracted by immediate things in order to keep focus on the long-term things that we should focus on. Then on the agreeableness side, the default network under compassion seems to be associated with our ability to mentalize, or our ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to imagine how they might have felt in our situation. The insula also with mimicry and the ability to, with non-verbal gestures, automatically mimic what other people are doing, seems to be also associated with something like compassion. Politeness, or the tendency to not engage in norm-violating behavior, is associated with a reduction in aggression, and there's also higher politeness. To my knowledge, the relationship between testosterone and politeness is quite complex, and the relationship between testosterone and aggression is quite complex. And so there's a estrogenic mediational pathway and a few other mediational pathways that also have to be considered, but it does seem indirectly to have an impact on something like aggression, and there's also sometimes norm-violating behavior, which is the inverse of politeness, whereas serotonin seems to be positively related, or increases in politeness as well. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of evidence on neuroticism, which I think is quite a frequent, with a high latency and quite a frequently studied construct in the neuroscience as well. And so reuptake of serotonin is often prescribed with mood disorders and associated with that neurotransmitters. We also know that with long-term experience of stress, the excretion of cortisol in order to deal with it is also and is related to associated with broader neuroticism as well. But interestingly, there's also a unique differentiation that needs to be derived from the hippocampus and hypothalamus and their broader brain networks that they form part of. So you've got the under neuroticism, I'm going to take a calculated guess and say that the flight-free system in the future might be more saliently associated with volatility. There's no evidence for that. That would be my suspicion. But we do see something like these broad networks, like the behavioral inhibition system and the flight-free system, really coming to the fore with something like neuroticism. And so with withdrawal, that avoidance of goals, the behavioral inhibition system seems to be associated with that. An increase in, say, for example, something like anxiety and depression reduces the pursuit of uncertain goals and the associated uncertainty that they bring. And then obviously this flight-free system almost reflects an immediate response to, and the hypothalamus associated with immediate response to threats that are in your environment, and might serve as an explanation partly for withdrawal and maybe perhaps for volatility in the future as well. Okay, so interestingly, from an openness intellect point of view, more specifically, obviously there's that dopaminergic structure that through projections to the dorsal frontal cortex allows you to take more, or almost makes more information salient to you and take it in. And at the same time, we also know that from a frontal parietal control network, with the intake of that information, it's also closely associated apparently with something like working memory and processing the logical sequences or combinations that we make between information seems to be very relevant for aspect intellect. At the same time, with openness to experience, there seems to be some evidence to suggest that openness experience might be related to reduced coherence and frontal matter, and also with lower working memory. And that's also why I mentioned earlier, very high openness sometimes could be problematic if also associated with very low intellect, or with low intellect at the same time, and could have implications for over-imaginativeness or not understanding what the logical combinations are that you make between things. The finding that intellect is associated with something like the frontal control network and working memory is also not surprising. We know, not outside of the neuroscientific literature, that aspect intellect is also the strongest correlate of cognitive ability of the personality dimensions and factors and aspects. With openness in the broad, we also know that it's associated with the default network, and there appears to be you'll know that I spoke about the default network in mentalizing earlier with agreeableness, but at the same time, it also seems to be with higher thought, something like understanding our situation, the present, future, and the past is also associated with this network, and helps us to create generative and creative thought as a consequence of something like openness intellect. Okay, like I mentioned, extroversion coincidentally is a social characteristic, and there's actually a stronger reward-seeking type of thing that underpins it. And so we know that dopaminergic substructure is associated with this reward-seeking behavior, to explore things, to drive us, to motivate us to explore things external to us, to ourselves. And as a consequence, it has also been connected with something, the reward and evaluation network in the brain, which is associated with some of the brain structures that are outlined on this slide. Now, interestingly, I spoke about the seek and then reinforcing network. And so we know that it's important that we don't just explore and seek things external to ourselves, but if we find something nice, that it reinforces that loop to continue us to seek things external to ourselves. And so we've got this drive to seek things external to ourselves, and then we excrete under enthusiasm what's often also referred to as our endogenous opiates, or our sort of internal drugs that says, oh, this is very nice, go do that again. And that cycle of seeking behavior is reinforced in our behavior. So that brings us to the end of extroversion, or the neurological foundations of the personality traits and aspects. Like I said, there certainly is a lot more to be done in this field, but as an emerging field, and for the following decade or more that we're going to be busy with, I think there could be very interesting findings from an interdisciplinary review that could expand our current understanding of this field. And it's not subject to criticism. I think there is a lot more discovery that still needs to come, and replication studies with larger samples that we'll need in the future. But I think it's something to keep abreast of, and something interesting that is happening in our field. Okay, so let's speak about some of the applications of something like the periodic table of personality, the 10 aspects in the workplace. I'll also relate it a bit more to therapy a bit later. Why do I want to focus on individual work performance? I often recite this quote because it's a powerful and such a meaningful quote by two famous scholars at also Minnesota University, Professor John Campbell and Professor Brenton Varick. I don't think he's at Minnesota anymore. I think he studied there. I think he's at Florida State University now. And what they quoted in this article on generic work performance is that individual work performance is the basic building block on which the entire economy is based. Without individual performance, there's no team performance, no unit performance, no organizational performance, no economic sector performance, no GDP. And so in the workplace, when I'm trying to apply personality, if we can relate, I also mentioned that we not only need to understand the structure, but also how it relates to important outcomes in our environment, if I can rate it to such an important criterion variable, we know that we're in business. So, like I mentioned, apart from the quote, Campbell said that individual work performance is the most important variable that we often study as industrial psychologists. It might be something else, maybe academic performance if you're an educational psychologist, or it could be well-being related factors if you're a clinical psychologist, or general increases in susceptibility and improvement as a consequence of something like therapy. But in this case, I'm going to use a variable in the workplace to make my claims. So we know that individual work performance is an important variable studied. Other dependent variables, and here is not a direct quote, but a derivation of that of Campbell and Merrick. So work engagement is also important, but if we had no performance, there would be no job to be engaged with. And so performance still remain a very important outcome variable that we have to study. And then to define work performance, I'm simply going to refer to it as the individual actions that people take to achieve collective goals. And I'm going to use evidence on how personality, the 10 aspects you need to correlate with work performance, to illustrate why it's so important that we also focus on that level of personality as well. Now, just to give you some conceptual framework to think about performance, I've published a study with Dr. Nicola Taylor where we've identified 5 broad dimensions of generic performance, and I'll also use those as outcome variables to show you what the unique relationships is that the 10 aspects have, or this so-called periodic table have, with these particular outcomes. And when I speak about outcomes, we'll be interested in role performance, task performance, or the core things that people have to do on the job. But we know that people are more than the task that they do on the job. And so personality could also contribute or help us to predict people's extra role performance. So, for example, the degree to which people go the extra mile or do more than what is expected of them. And often these citizenship behaviors that we display in organizations. There's also adaptive performance, or how we make sense of the chaos in the workplace and maintain our performance while we have to make sense of our environment. Leadership performance, and here I'm not referring to status, but simply informal influence that is exerted by employees on a daily basis. We all can influence other people independent of whether we're managers or not. And then finally, counterproductive performance. So we know there's a light side performance, but there's also a dark side, or a so-called dark side of performance. So we'll also look at how these personality characteristics might be associated with something like counterproductive performance, or where people actively try to undermine the goals of an organization. Okay, so and another important point that I'd also like to make, because there is these sort of broader differentiations that we can draw between these dimensions. But I'd also like to, I'm also going to relay some evidence on general performance. And yes, it's possible, because we do see that even though there's sub-dimensions of performance or competencies or whatever you'd like to call them, there seems to be something independent of the job that you do that seems to be generic across jobs. And so I've conducted a study with Professor Leonie van der Vaart at Northwest University, and there does seem to be a strong general factor of individual work performance as well, almost as if or there appears to be that this general factor could explain 60% of the common variance in performance. So there is we can use a general factor of performance as an outcome variable as well, and I'll be relaying some of the evidence. And we've replicated this general factor based on international meta-analytical studies that has also been conducted. So let's take general work performance. If you haven't seen it yet, fascinating and revised meta-analysis has recently been published by Professor Paul Sackett, where they found that personality-based integrity test is highly predictive of job performance, validity estimate of 0.31, and is a powerful tool as a consequence of its predictability for future performance for selection. Now, you'll remember we spoke about integrity previously. That is a meta trait, and it's a meta trait also called stability, that helps us as a collective to aspire to collective goals. And isn't that what an organization is about? Now, in this meta-analytical study, in contrast to previous meta-analytical studies, a personality-based construct like integrity seems to be as predictive as cognitive ability of future job performance. Almost, it had the exact same predictability as cognitive ability, and it's quite a welcome finding in the South African context, because we know that something like cognitive ability has a has a potential adverse impact in selection decisions, and we can almost unit weight or give the safe weighting of personality when we select people, which has less adverse impact. And as a consequence, we can include that in our selection batteries to reduce potential moral discrimination as a consequence of our selection procedures. It's also fascinating that you'll remember previously that I said that there's important environmental factors that activate certain personality traits. And so there's fascinating evidence to suggest that even something like occupational characteristics could mediate or moderate the relationship between something like the big 5 and job performance. We don't have evidence on that on the 10 aspects yet, and I think that could be a fascinating study to pursue in the future. So wink, wink to everybody who's interested to take it on. But we do see that the personality dimensions that are predictive of job performance are quite starkly different depending on the jobs that people find them in. And I'd like to direct your attention a bit lower to points 8 and 9 here. What you see with these percentages are the relative weights that each of these personality dimensions carry. And so C would represent conscientiousness, A would represent agreeableness, S would represent emotional stability, E would represent extroversion, and so forth. Sorry if I missed one, but I think it's obvious you can easily infer what they should mean. And so what's fascinating is that you see for something like a professional job, where the intake of new information and the making of decisions based on it is quite important. Openness, it carries about 66% of the weight in predicting professionals' future job performance. And so in this meta-analytical study, what Owens did is they looked at different job families, and then they looked at what the weights is that personality carry in predicting future job performance. Whereas you'll see that often something like conscientiousness generalize across the positions, but what's new and interesting is what the relative weight of other personality dimensions are. So openness carrying a larger weight even for professionals when predicting job performance. Or if you take managerial jobs, look at what the relative weight is that something like extroversion explains in future job performance for managerial jobs. You'll recall that previously I've referred to those that highly tried between intellect, assertiveness from extroversion, and industrious as predictors of leadership performance. And I think assertiveness from the 10 aspects, particularly here, might also be predictive of performance in managerial type of jobs. Or you can look at the take, for example, sales jobs under number 3, where conscientiousness is important, but that extroversion also starts to play an important role in terms of its relative weight in predicting future job performance. So all to say that even in the work context, you've got this complex interaction between heredity and characteristics associated with the environment in which you function, which determine whether you're going to be successful or not at performing at your job. Okay, so here I've got the 10 specific aspects, and I want to provide you with interesting evidence about how they quite differ or are unique in their predictability for both task and contextual performance. So you'll recall that I've previously referred to in-role and extra-role performance. Task performance is a synonym, perhaps slightly different, but more or less the same thing as in-role performance, and contextual performance or citizenship behavior or extra-role performance refer to those things where people go above and beyond what's required of them in their job to be successful. And so what you can see here is for task performance, industriousness certainly plays a more important role as orderliness, highlighting the importance of almost double that role for task performance, and highlights the importance of maybe differentiating those two constructs under conscientiousness. You also see that politeness relative to compassion, and politeness I'm theorizing because it's proclivity not to be norm-violating behavior and part of larger construct stability or integrity, also seem to have stronger relationships with both dimensions of performance compared to something like compassion. Volatility, also associated with that, the inverse of volatility would be not to give expression to your aggressive impulses, and it's also to maintain your impulses and self-regulate. In this case, it's more so than withdrawal, highly negatively correlated with, not highly, but more strongly negatively correlated with task and contextual performance. Intellect, interestingly relative to openness, perhaps due to its associations with intelligence, both are correlated, but intellects seem to be more consistently correlated with task and contextual performance. And then finally, you do see that assertiveness, it's interesting, enthusiasm is more related to helpful type of behavior, and it's got that strong interpersonal component. It's also, you remember from the previous correlation matrix, related to something like compassion under the 10 aspects. And contextual behavior is about going the extra mile and assisting others, which might explain that finding, whereas assertiveness it's got that drive component to seek things external to yourself, and that motivational component to it that is more related to the actual task that needs to be performed relative to enthusiasm. And so this was a meta-analysis that was conducted by Judge. I've given a very summative overview of how the 10 aspects related to different performance dimensions, but I highly recommend that you get this meta-analysis that has been conducted by Professor Timothy Judge and further read on these interesting findings. So based on that same meta-analysis, Judge said that if you take the 10 aspects into consideration, you can, in comparison to the trait theory, you can almost have 10% more variance that is explained in overall performance, 12% more variance that can be explained in task performance, and 40% more variance that can be explained in contextual performance. And he concluded that it could be meaningful to take a more detailed approach to personality measurement when we want to increase our predictability of future job performance and use it to make selection decisions about people. And it's all about this. I think Cronbach and Leeser beautifully put it at this bandwidth fidelity problem, this dilemma that we have, is to find a compromise between reliably measuring things and at the same time also going to have high fidelity or things that really resonate and make sense, or high face validity type of dimensions in personality. And so sometimes facets might be too detailed and hard to make reliable inferences of, even at an item level, and sometimes the broad traits might have less fidelity or less understandable. And maybe the 10 aspects could be like the Goldilocks principles, not too hot, not too cold, not too detailed, not too broad. That might be usefully portrayed on a page and to provide feedback on all to make decisions on. But that said, I think it's also important that we tailor the level at which we measure personality dimensions also at the appropriate level of what we're trying to predict with it. So in other words, if I go more detailed on the performance side of what I want to predict, I need to go in more detail on the associated personality level when I'm trying to predict, so that we, in this hierarchy on both the performance or the personality side, or whatever your outcome variable is that you're interested in, that you accordingly adjust it at the level at which you're measuring both. So I've spoken about in-role and extra-role performance. You'll remember that there's 3 others. It appears that something like, based on the Hogan personality inventory, something like ambition and adjustment seems to be highly related to adaptive performance. It's not a part for part, but something like ambition might speak to something like assertiveness, and adjustment to something like volatility, or apologies, I think withdrawal. And so what you see is that something like assertiveness might help you to preemptively foresee how things might change in the future and drive you to preemptively change those things and help you to be more adaptive. And adjustment, or your withdrawn distress, or the inverse of that would be your stability, might almost help you to reactively appropriate respond to change emotionally as a consequence of having to adapt. So both of those seem to contribute to people's adaptive performance. I've previously mentioned that so we were able to also replicate that finding based on the work personality index. We found that aspects, assertiveness and self-assured, were also strong predictive variables of something like adaptive performance. Interestingly, previous work, that meta-analytical studies that has been conducted by Judge, here we're moving from adaptive performance more to the leadership performance side, found that and intellect related to openness make up this heroic trait I referred to earlier, things that we would like to characteristics in people that want us to emulate them. And these characteristics also seem to be related to leadership performance, or seems to make a holy triad of things that we could use to predict leadership performance in the future. Now, we haven't done any studies in South Africa to see how personality-based integrity or what a predictive outcome, what the strongest predictors of counterproductive performance are. Based on meta-analytical studies, a study that has been conducted by Pletzer, we think that it's a very strong inclinations to not engage in norm-violating behavior that's associated with integrity, and we know that integrity is also one of your strongest negative correlations with something like counterproductive performance. So the higher people are on personality-based integrity, the lower their engagement in counterproductive behavior like sabotage or stealing or undermining other people to achieve goals are going to be. And so aspects that might be particularly close to something like integrity might include something like orderliness. Remember, it's got that settings, following rules set by the self and others associated with it. There's politeness and also associated with being well-mannered and being compliant towards other people. And of course, volatility, not engaging in aggressive type of norm-violating behavior, but restricting that impulses that might be associated with integrity and also help you to not engage in counterproductive behavior. That is a fascinating, I think, picture in that study, meta-analytical study, they go down into the weeds in a facet level. And you're welcome to read more. It's in the reference list, read more about that later after the presentation. Okay, a little bit of my aesthetic inclination, so please forgive me. I'm glad to see that there's still some people with us. And I'm more going to speak about the development side. It's as applied to the workplace, but I think in this case, we've spoken about the usefulness of the 10 aspects as relate to the prediction of future job performance and even the 5 factors and the general or 2 meta traits. But I think it's important that we also speak about the development of personality, because it's often a very important nature-nurture question that's often posed. But before I do that, I want to get back to the audience, and I want to ask you a question. When you look at this, when I had the fortunate opportunity to visit Florence or Firenze in Italy, and in the academia, I had the privilege to stand in one of the most incredible statues that I've ever seen in my entire life, done by the famous Michelangelo, called David. And in front of this David, when I stood in front of the David, I read a question that was posed to me, and the question that was asked is, when you look at the statue of David, do you think he's on his way to fight Goliath, or did you think he came back victorious? And if you don't mind to drop in the chat, when you look at the statue of David, not the infinitesimal, the small person below the David, but the big statue in front of you, do you think that the David came back victorious from the fight with Goliath, or do you think he's heading towards the fight? Please let me know. Anybody can respond. So do you think David is heading towards a fight, or did he came back victorious?
We have a few victorious in the Q&A side.
Okay. I say somebody else also say, Andrew's saying, I imagine him getting ready for a bath. So that's coming back, maybe take a sip of cognac and celebrate his victory. Okay. So it's interesting, I think different people can take different interpretations from the same image. My experience when I stood in front of the statue is that David is still heading towards Goliath. And in some sense, I also felt that, man, there's always areas for improvement, and the fight is never over, and you should always try. And same with personality. It's seldom that you're high on all the traits and integrated and well adapted, and there's always areas for improvement in your own profile. And I just thought that when I stood there, I intensely felt it, and I thought I'd share that as well. And I'd like to now bring you to whether it's possible that personality could change or not based on the recent meta-analytical evidence. Now, I've got good news. Even though we know that there's a hereditary component, we know that environmental influences could also help or also have an impact on how personality is activated, in some sense also change slightly, because we're not blank slates, but in the animal kingdom, we're the blankest of slates. And here, I'm especially appreciative of my clinical colleagues who've done exceptional research on this field. Very little published in personality or in IO-psychology type of research, but in the clinical field, a great scholar called Roberts has conducted a clinical systematic review to determine what the meta-analytical impact is of clinical interventions for clinical and non-clinical populations. So they did not only focus on people with severe suffering from severe psychopathology, but also looked at non-clinical populations who didn't struggle, and what the impact of therapeutic interventions were on changes in their traits. And lo and behold, what they did found, and here you have to also see it in perspective. So we typically see over lifespan development, one standard deviation improvement in people as a consequence of aging in their personality. What they found was that you can achieve almost half of what you achieve in a lifetime by undergoing intense therapeutic interventions. So at this stage, especially in the therapeutic realm, it does see, and I think there's a case to be made for workplace counseling or counseling in the workplace as well. You can bring about change in somebody's personality trait specifically. They haven't looked at the aspect yet. It could be very interesting to look at that level as well. And so what you see is some decent effect sizes reported for neuroticism, not unexpected, something that might often bring you to a therapeutic intervention. Positive changes in neuroticism, positive changes in interpersonal domains like extroversion and agreeableness, and even for something like conscientiousness, when you clarify your goals and your values and something like acceptance and commitment therapy in order to set new priorities in your life. Interestingly, it wasn't, therapeutic interventions wasn't related to a change in openness to experience, something that is an interesting finding and could be explained further. But at least for now, it seems for four of these traits, there's good news and it could be improved as a consequence of development. And it seems as if especially something like cognitive behavioral therapy could be an effective approach to bring about improvement. And it doesn't have to be that long. These are sometimes, they've shown that you can reach a ceiling effect where even 4 to 8 weeks of weekly sessions could already bring about these level of changes that they've seen. Okay, so like I said, I think there's a wonderful case to be made for something like work-based counseling, and hats off to the clinical practitioners for even bringing about real change in people's personality structures. I think we're going quickly to run out of time, but there is short therapeutic methods that originated from something like the cognitive behavioral framework of therapy that I think could be quite conducive to the workplace. There's a proliferation of research about its uses in the broader clinical and counseling literature as well. I've published an article of Dr. Xander van Lill on its useful applications in the South African context. It's an open source publication in SageUp that you're welcome to consult as well. But basically, from a personality point of view, this therapeutic framework addresses two kinds of therapeutic processes, and that's increasing an open response style, which might help with something like increasing your flexibility, while at the same time also addressing a higher engaging response style, more that stability component, where you clarify your values and commit yourself to a particular course of action and future goals that you want to achieve. And this hasn't been explicitly tested, but from a personality point of view, we do know that cognitive behavioral therapy is suitable to change personality structure. And as a consequence of acceptance and commitment therapy's origin from cognitive behavioral therapy, there might be some very interesting relationships with personality change as well. And it could be something that we could investigate in the South African context. Okay, and that brings me to a conclusion. Personality has an evolutionary history. That's one of the key takeaways that I'd like you to take with you. It has, we can say that because it appears as if there's a neurobiological foundation to these characteristics. It helps us to reach consensus in our field and navigate this difficult area, to make sense of the dimensionality of personality. And as a consequence, we can increase and enrich our understanding and even find more useful ways to apply it in selection and development contexts. And I want to leave you, just before I play a last piece of music, before we wrap up the presentation. This is when you walk in the streets of Rome, you often see the small acronym SPQR used, and it means Senate and the People of Rome. And I translated that in Southern Sotho, one of the most beautifulest languages, and it translates roughly into Senate la Batu Afrika Baroa, meaning between the Senate of the people. It's not just those in charge, but also we that rule. And I'd like to translate that, or take this to this particular quote that I'm going to use now. And this is a quote by Steven Pinker that speaks to this, the people type of thing. And it states, I'm going to read it verbatimly: inborn human desires are a nuisance to those with utopian and totalitarian visions, which often amount to the same thing. What stands in the way of the fear of most utopias is not pestilence and drought, but human behavior. And I think what's so fantastic about the fact that we are predisposed to be different and unique in our own way is even people with totalitarian visions can't mold us into what they think with propaganda. We are inherently who we are, and it's a force that works against this potential oppressive way. And so not being born a blank slate also has societal and incredible ramifications. I'm going to play a last beautiful piece of music by Yo-Yo-Ma of Johann Sebastian Bach, a cello concerto. And you'll see that in the beginning of the piece, he says, culture is the thing that binds us, but also helps us to express ourselves. But I'd like to say, include personality along with culture in that same quote that you'll see in this initial video. And so what I'd like to leave you with is that from an individual difference perspective, people are both the same. We have this common typology, some more that appears to have some universal credit that we can use to explain things that we need to aspire, but we're also uniquely different in our own right on these same dimensions. And I'll leave you with that, and I'll play you a piece of beautiful music before we hopefully can get to questions and answers. Thank you, colleagues. The stage is open for questions and answers. Happy to address any of those if you have it based on the presentation, or correspond with you in email if I don't know the immediate question, need to refer to you to other literature.
Thanks very much, Xander. You can either post some questions in the Q&A, or you're welcome to put your hand up and we can allow you to talk. I don't know if I can see the order, so apologies if I skip over someone. Please feel free to ask your questions. I see, Patrick, you made a few statements here, and I'm not too sure of the question, but if you would like to pose a specific question, please just go ahead and raise your hand. And then Trisha said, Xander, did you consider neurofeedback as an intervention when you were speaking about changes in personality, I imagine?
No, so in that particular study that I've referenced, I wouldn't be surprised if it makes a difference, but they mainly focused on therapeutic frameworks that has been developed out of the neuroscientific domain. So I think they've included psychodynamic approaches to therapy, stuff like cognitive behavioral therapy. What was the other framework? So more commonly known frameworks that have evolved out of the psychology literature in broad, not necessarily from the neurofeedback, neuroscientific domain. But I'm certain that there's very interesting findings on that as well. I don't know if it's been translated to personality. That could be very interesting, and also interesting to study in the future, but especially for something like neuroticism or something with a high emotional latency to it.
Great. And then Dr. Gerard said, if a person measures high on neuroticism, can it be seen as clinically significant of instability and or depression? So what you often see in personality dimensions is, let's say, for example, neuroticism is subscales related to anxiety and depression. So we know that, especially in the work context,
those traits are highly correlated with stuff like work burnout. It's not entirely the same as depression or those type of mood type of disorders. I'd be careful to do it, but it certainly can give you a nudge of whether somebody is heading that way, or would be susceptible, will indicate a susceptibility for something like depression or anxiety. But I think something like the big depression or a typical type of depression-related inventories might service. Never do psychological assessments in isolation, and I'll include those to further verify a hypothesis about a potential client suffering from those type of psychopathology. And I'm also speaking out of my domain. I just want to explicitly say I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm an industrial psychologist. So take it from where it comes. That would be my intuition, and I'm. But that's what I would suggest.
Just a reminder, everyone. Like I mentioned in the beginning, you will be receiving that email with the BTI, the quiz, etc. And it should be coming from hofmeyer@jvrafrica.co.za. But if you wouldn't mind finishing that before Thursday, if you do want your results in your report. So just a reminder. I see no other questions, but we'll give it a minute or two in case someone has something brewing.
Andrew, so you thought David took a bath or was on his way to take a bath?
Indeed, it's just odd that you'd either be naked going to war or coming back from war.
Oh, gosh, I'm a bit slow. I get it. I finally get it. It was concretely funny, but it's also abstractly very funny. Any answers?
I think we need questions before we need answers, Xander. Perhaps the presentation was that thorough that there's no extra. But great presentation, and I think there's a lot of resources for us to kind of delve into after the fact. And there's some thank yous coming through.
Okay, awesome.
Sorry, well, just before everyone does drop off or are thinking of their questions, I just want to remind you, I have posted a PDF version of the slides in the chat, as well as a link to the quiz and the feedback form. They will also be emailed, as Andrew said, from Hofmeyer just a little bit later. But please, if you do want to get started on them right away, you can just click on the links in the chat. And then, Bakiza, I'm not 100% sure, but I just, in terms of your message, but you're saying that they will receive a link to complete the BTI and get their own factors, 10 aspects and facets reports. So if you do want those, no?
Yes. So like Sandra has said, and Andrew has also said, you can complete the BTI, and then this 10 aspects that Xander's explained is something different that isn't in your typical BTI report. So we will provide that to you after you complete it. Like Andrew has also said, if you could complete it by Thursday, that would be great.
Yeah, apologies for putting the pressure on everyone, but we do need to obviously make sure that we wrap up and get all our reports through before the office closes. I know from my side, I'm putting pressure on for the quiz and the feedback for CPD purposes. And obviously at the BTR, the product team wants to make sure that they wrap up and get everyone their reports before going on holiday.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Pakiza. Thank you, Andre.
Not a problem. And thank you, Xander. Great presentation, very thorough.
Well, if there's not any other questions, I think we'll remain at the back. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to attend this presentation. I've seen a few colleagues attending from a previous presentation that I've presented on the topic. Again, thank you for coming back. Apologies if there was some repetition, but appreciate you being here. It's been fantastic.